Dr. Emily Carter was one of the most respected scientists in her field. She had spent years studying human decomposition and the mysteries surrounding what happens to the body after death. Along with her dedicated team, she had recently been granted approval for a groundbreaking experiment. The idea was simple yet controversial. Place a high-tech camera inside a sealed coffin to capture time-lapse footage of the decomposition process in a highly controlled environment. The experiment wasn't about morbid curiosity. Dr. Carter believed it could advance forensic science, helping solve crimes and answer questions that had puzzled scientists for centuries. Still, the project wasn't without its critics. Some called it unethical, while others thought it was a waste of resources. But Dr. Carter was determined. She believed in the importance of her work and hoped the results would speak for themselves. The day of the experiment's launch was filled with a mix of excitement and nervous energy. The coffin had been carefully prepared in the lab, with its interior lined with sensors and a small motion-activated camera. Every piece of equipment had been tested multiple times to ensure accuracy. The coffin wasn't underground but placed in a secure, temperature-controlled lab environment to maintain precise conditions. Dr. Carter addressed her team before they began. "This isn't just about science," she said with a calm but confident voice. "It's about understanding processes that have been part of life for as long as humans have existed. Let's approach this with the respect it deserves." Her team nodded, inspired by her words. They finalized the setup, making sure the camera and sensors were working properly. The camera had advanced capabilities, capable of recording clear footage even in complete darkness. It was designed to run continuously and send live feeds to the monitors in the lab's control room. When everything was ready, the team placed the camera inside the coffin and sealed it shut. A moment of silence followed as they activated the equipment. The monitors came to life, showing a clear image of the coffin's interior. At first glance, it was unremarkable, a still, silent space waiting for time to pass. But to the scientists, this was the beginning of something extraordinary. For the first few hours, everything was quiet. The team took turns watching the feed, ensuring the camera was working as expected. There was nothing unusual, just the expected stillness of the sealed coffin. Some team members joked to lighten the mood, while others stayed focused, logging every detail. As night fell and the lab emptied, Dr. Carter stayed behind to keep an eye on the feed. She sipped her coffee, her eyes glued to the monitor. Everything seemed routine, but she couldn't shake a strange feeling in the back of her mind. It wasn't fear, exactly, just an odd sense that this experiment might reveal more than they had anticipated. Little did she know, the ordinary start to their project would soon take a turn none of them could have expected. The lab was quiet the next morning, with the faint hum of machinery filling the air. Dr. Carter arrived early, her mind still focused on the live feed from the night before. She had spent hours watching the monitor, but nothing unusual had happened. Still, something about the experiment made her uneasy, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. By mid-morning, the rest of the team had arrived, ready to review the footage from the previous night. Jake, one of the younger researchers, was in charge of checking the recordings. He sat at the control desk, scrolling through hours of footage. The screen showed the same static image of the coffin's interior, dark, still, and unchanging. "Looks like a slow start," Jake joked, trying to lighten the mood. "This might be the most boring footage we've ever recorded." The team chuckled, but Dr. Carter didn't laugh. Her intuition told her something wasn't right. "Let's stay focused," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Even the smallest details can be important." As Jake continued to review the footage, he suddenly froze. His hand hovered over the keyboard, and his eyes widened. "Wait," he said, his voice sharp. Something just moved. The room went silent. Everyone gathered around the monitor, their eyes fixed on the screen. Jake rewound the footage and played it back in slow motion. At first, it was hard to see, but then it became clear. A faint shadow seemed to sweep across the frame. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "What is that?" Sarah, another researcher asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Carter leaned in closer, studying the screen. "It could be a glitch," she said, trying to keep everyone calm. "Let's check the equipment." The team spent the next hour inspecting the camera and sensors, but everything appeared to be working perfectly. There were no malfunctions, no errors in the system. The shadow remained unexplained. By now, a sense of unease had settled over the lab. The team replayed the footage again and again, searching for clues. Some suggested it might be a trick of the light or dust particles caught on the lens. But the shadow's movement was too deliberate, too distinct, to be easily dismissed. "Should we stop the experiment?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. Dr. Carter shook her head. "No, we need to gather more data. If this is something unexpected, we have to figure out what it is." The team agreed, though the atmosphere in the lab had changed. What had started as a straightforward scientific study now felt like something much more mysterious. That night, as the lab emptied once again, Dr. Carter stayed behind to monitor the live feed. She stared at the screen, her heart beating faster than usual. The coffin looked the same as always, still, silent, and ordinary. But Dr. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer alone in their experiment. The following night, the lab was shrouded in an uneasy stillness. Dr. Carter sat alone in the control room, her eyes glued to the live feed on the monitor. The coffin on the screen looked as it always did, silent and unmoving. But the shadow from the previous footage haunted her thoughts. She couldn't dismiss it as a simple glitch, and her curiosity pushed her to continue watching. Around midnight, something unexpected happened. A faint noise, like a soft scraping, echoed through the speakers connected to the camera inside the coffin. Dr. Carter sat up straight, her heart pounding. She turned up the volume, trying to make out the sound. It was subtle, almost too quiet to hear, but it was there. She hit the record button, ensuring the strange noise would be documented. Moments later, the sound stopped. The camera feed remained unchanged, showing the dark, still interior of the coffin. Dr. Carter leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Was the noise coming from the coffin, or was it an issue with the equipment? She made a note to discuss it with the team in the morning. By the next day, the team gathered around the monitor once again to review the latest footage. Jake played the recording, and the strange noise filled the room. Everyone listened intently, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. "What is that?" Sarah asked, her voice tense. "It doesn't sound like anything natural." Jake shook his head. "It's not interference. The audio equipment is working perfectly." The team debated possible explanations. Some suggested it could be air pressure inside the coffin or vibrations from the lab's machinery. But as they continued to analyze the footage, another anomaly appeared, this time more unsettling. In the middle of the recording, the camera captured a brief faint flash of light inside the coffin. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough to send a chill through the room. Dr. Carter replayed the footage in slow motion. The light seemed to originate from the center of the coffin, but there was no logical source for it. The coffin was sealed, and the camera had no built-in light. The team exchanged uneasy glances, the tension in the room growing thicker. "This doesn't make sense," Jake said. "How can there be light inside a sealed coffin?" Dr. Carter took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "We need to stay objective," she said firmly. "Let's document everything and see if the pattern repeats." The team agreed, but their confidence was shaken. As night fell, the lab felt heavier, as though an invisible presence lingered in the air. Dr. Carter decided to stay late again, determined to uncover the truth. As she sat in the dimly lit control room, watching the live feed, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The experiment had started as a simple scientific study, but now it felt like they were stepping into the unknown, and something inside the coffin was waiting for them. That night, the atmosphere in the lab was heavier than ever before. Dr. Carter sat alone in the control room, the dim light of the monitor casting shadows across her face. The camera feed showed the same dark, still coffin. Yet, after the strange sounds and the mysterious flash of light from the night before, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The lab was silent except for the soft hum of the machines. Dr. Carter sipped her coffee, trying to focus, but her nerves were on edge. Suddenly, the speakers connected to the coffin's camera emitted a faint creak. She froze, her eyes darting to the monitor. The image hadn't changed, but the sound was unmistakable. It was as if something inside the coffin had shifted. She leaned closer to the screen, her heart pounding. A few seconds later, the sound came again, this time louder. It wasn't a glitch or interference. It was deliberate, like something moving against the wood of the coffin. Dr. Carter quickly pressed the record button, documenting every moment. The creaking stopped, leaving an eerie silence. Just as she began to relax, a new sound echoed through the speakers, a soft tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. It was faint but unmistakable, as though something was knocking from inside the coffin. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone to call Jake. "You need to come to the lab," she whispered, her voice barely steady. "Something's happening." Within minutes, Jake arrived, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. Dr. Carter replayed the live footage, showing him the sounds and the tapping. Jake's face paled as he listened. "This doesn't make any sense," he said. "The coffin is sealed. Nothing should be able to move inside." They decided to check the coffin in person. Armed with flashlights and recording devices, they entered the lab. The coffin sat in the middle of the room, untouched and undisturbed. But the air felt colder, and an unexplainable tension filled the space. Jake approached the coffin cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the polished wood. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Dr. Carter strained to listen. The faint tapping was now audible without the speakers, coming from inside. Her instincts told her to open the coffin, but her mind warned against it. "Let's check the sensors first," she said, trying to keep calm. Jake nodded and quickly reviewed the equipment. Everything appeared normal. No malfunctions, no errors. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it started, leaving an unsettling silence. They decided to leave the coffin sealed and return to the control room. Back at the monitors, the live feed showed the same dark, empty interior. Yet the sense of unease only grew. "What if we're not alone in this experiment?" Jake asked, breaking the silence. Dr. Carter didn't answer. She stared at the screen, her mind racing with possibilities. For the first time, she wondered if they had gone too far, if their experiment had crossed a boundary that shouldn't have been crossed. The following day, the entire team gathered in the control room. Dr. Carter explained the events from the previous night, playing the recordings of the tapping sounds for everyone to hear. The tension in the room was palpable. No one wanted to admit it, but there was a growing sense of fear among them. The experiment, which had started as a scientific pursuit, was now something else entirely. Jake replayed the footage on the big screen, showing the faint but deliberate knocking from inside the coffin. "This isn't random," he said. It's like something is trying to get our attention." Sarah, visibly uneasy, crossed her arms. "But that's impossible. The coffin is sealed. There's no way anything could be moving in there. What if it's just the wood expanding or contracting due to temperature changes?" Dr. Carter nodded thoughtfully but didn't seem convinced. "It's a possibility," she said, "but we've accounted for temperature control. This isn't adding up." One of the older researchers, Dr. Allen, spoke up. "Maybe we should open the coffin. It's the only way to know for sure." The suggestion hung in the air like a heavy cloud. The team exchanged uncertain glances. Opening the coffin was against protocol, but at this point, it seemed like the only logical next step. Finally, Dr. Carter made the decision. "We'll open it," she said, her voice steady. "But only with full precautions. We document everything, and we do it together." That evening, the team prepared to unseal the coffin. They wore gloves and masks, treating the situation with the utmost seriousness. The lab was silent except for the faint buzz of the equipment. The coffin sat in the center of the room, its polished surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights. Dr. Carter took a deep breath. "Let's do this," she said, signaling Jake and Dr. Allen to begin. They carefully unlatched the coffin, the sound of the locks clicking open echoing in the room. As they lifted the lid, the team held their breath, expecting to see something. But when the lid was fully open, the interior of the coffin looked exactly as it should. Empty, except for the camera and sensors. Everyone exhaled, a mix of relief and confusion. "There's nothing here," Jake said, frowning. "It's just normal." Dr. Carter inspected the interior closely, her hands trembling slightly. "Check the sensors again," she said. Jake pulled out his tablet, scanning the data in real time. Everything appeared normal. No movements, no unusual readings. But as the team began to relax, a faint sound echoed through the lab. It wasn't coming from the coffin this time. It was coming from the speakers connected to the camera. A soft, raspy whisper filled the air, sending chills down everyone's spines. "Let me out." The room froze. No one spoke. No one moved. Dr. Carter stared at the coffin, her heart pounding. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. And now, it was no longer just an experiment. It was a mystery they couldn't ignore. The team stood in stunned silence, the eerie whisper lingering in their minds. "Let me out." The words replayed over and over, filling the room with an invisible weight. Dr. Carter was the first to speak, though her voice was quieter than usual. "Are we sure this came from the camera feed?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the speakers. Jake nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he checked the equipment. "There's no doubt," he said. "It came from inside the coffin, but it doesn't make sense. There's nothing in there." The team was at a loss for explanations. The whisper had sounded too real, too deliberate to be a glitch or a random noise. Dr. Allen, who had been skeptical of the supernatural, now looked pale. "This has gone beyond science," he muttered, shaking his head. Dr. Carter took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "We need to stay rational," she said firmly. "Let's review the footage again. Maybe we missed something." The team returned to the control room, their nerves on edge. Jake replayed the audio from the moment the whisper was captured. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a soft, raspy voice that seemed to echo in the silence. Everyone listened intently, searching for clues. Could it be interference? Sarah suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. Maybe something from another signal got picked up. Dr. Carter frowned. "It's possible, but unlikely. The lab is shielded from external signals to prevent contamination of our data." As they continued to analyze the footage, another anomaly appeared. This time, it wasn't just a sound. The camera feed showed a faint, glowing outline inside the coffin, a shape that seemed to shimmer for just a moment before disappearing. The team froze, their eyes glued to the screen. What is that?" Jake whispered. Dr. Carter's mind raced. The shape was too distinct to be dismissed as a trick of the light. It looked almost human, as though someone, or something, had briefly materialized inside the coffin. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But it's real. We need to figure out what we're dealing with." The lab felt colder now, the air heavy with tension. The team debated their next steps. Some wanted to shut down the experiment, while others insisted on continuing. Dr. Carter, torn between her scientific curiosity and a growing sense of dread, made the call. "We continue," she said, "but with extreme caution. We can't abandon this now." That night, the lab was quieter than ever. The team took turns monitoring the live feed, but no one felt at ease. The coffin remained sealed, and the camera showed only darkness. Yet the memory of the whisper and the glowing shape lingered in everyone's minds. As Dr. Carter watched the monitor in the early hours of the morning, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of uncovering something extraordinary and terrifying. Whatever was happening inside the coffin, It wasn't finished, and neither were they. The lab felt different the next day. The usual buzz of the team's conversations was replaced by silence. Everyone was on edge after the whisper and the glowing shape. Dr. Carter knew she had to keep the team focused, but even she couldn't ignore the growing unease in her chest. They spent the morning analyzing the data from the previous night. Jake carefully examined the footage frame by frame, while Sarah ran tests on the audio recording. "The sound is authentic," Sarah finally said, breaking the silence. "There's no distortion, no interference. It's as if the voice was recorded directly from inside the coffin." Jake added, "And the glowing shape. It's not a reflection or a camera glitch. The light source came from inside the coffin, but there's no logical explanation for it." Dr. Carter stood at the head of the table, listening carefully. "We need to stay calm," she said. "If we're dealing with something unknown, we have to approach it scientifically. Let's try to provoke a reaction." The team exchanged nervous glances. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "We'll ask it questions," Dr. Carter explained. "If there's a presence, maybe it can communicate." Despite their fear, the team agreed. They set up a microphone in the lab, connected it to the camera inside the coffin, and activated the live feed. The room was quiet as Dr. Carter stepped forward, her voice steady but soft. "If there's someone or something here, we want to understand. Can you tell us who you are?" For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The team held their breath, waiting for a response. Just as they began to think nothing would happen, the speakers emitted a faint, static-like sound. Then the whisper returned. "Help me," the voice said. The word sent chills through the room. It was the same raspy tone as before, but now it carried a sense of urgency. Jake's hands shook as he adjusted the volume. "Did it just respond?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Carter nodded, her face pale. "It did." The team gathered around the monitor, their fear mixed with fascination. Dr. Carter asked another question. "Why do you need help?" This time, the response was delayed. The static returned, louder now, followed by the faint sound of what seemed like a sigh. Then the voice spoke again. "Trapped." The single word echoed in the room, leaving the team speechless. It was clear that whatever was inside the coffin, or connected to it, wanted to communicate. But what did it mean to be trapped? And how could they help? As night fell, the team decided to continue the experiment. They monitored the live feed closely, hoping for more clues. But deep down, each of them wondered if they were getting involved in something far beyond their understanding. Dr. Carter sat alone in the control room, staring at the screen. The words repeated in her mind. "Help me. Trapped." For the first time, she began to question if they were truly in control, or if the experiment had taken on a life of its own. The lab was eerily silent that night, the air thick with tension. Dr. Carter sat in the control room, her team gathered around her. They replayed the whisper over and over. "Help me. Trapped." The words felt heavier each time they heard them, as if they carried a weight far beyond their meaning. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, breaking the silence. His voice was shaky, but there was determination in his eyes. Dr. Carter took a deep breath, steadying herself. "We need to keep going," she said. "If this is a form of communication, we can't stop now, but we have to be careful." The team set up additional equipment, including motion detectors and heat sensors, hoping to gather more data. They decided to leave the microphone active, allowing any potential responses to be recorded in real time. The lab felt colder as the night wore on, the stillness broken only by the faint hum of the machines. Dr. Carter spoke again into the microphone. "We're here to help. Can you tell us how you're trapped?" For a long time, there was no response. The team sat in tense anticipation, their eyes fixed on the monitor. Then the static returned, louder this time. It crackled and hissed, as though struggling to form words. Finally, the whisper came through once more. "Let me go." The words were clear, deliberate, and filled with a strange kind of sadness. Sarah shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. Let it go. What does that mean? Dr. Allen, who had remained skeptical throughout the experiment, leaned forward. It could mean anything, he said, or it could mean exactly what it says. Maybe this presence wants to be freed from the coffin. Dr. Carter considered his words carefully. She didn't fully understand what they were dealing with, but she couldn't deny the possibility. We need to open it again, she said finally. This time, we'll leave the camera running and document every step. The team hesitated but ultimately agreed. Together, they approached the coffin. The lab felt colder now, as though the air itself was holding its breath. With steady hands, Dr. Carter unlocked the coffin and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, the camera continued to record, capturing every detail. At first glance, the interior looked the same, empty, save for the equipment. But as they stared, a faint mist began to form, swirling in the center of the coffin. It shimmered faintly, almost like a figure trying to take shape. The team gasped, stepping back in shock. The mist grew brighter for a moment, then faded completely, leaving the coffin empty once more. The room was silent, but the tension had lifted, as though whatever had been inside was finally gone. Dr. Carter closed the coffin and stepped back, her heart pounding. I think we let it go, she said softly. The team looked at each other, their fear replaced by awe. They didn't have all the answers, but one thing was certain. This experiment had revealed something extraordinary, something far beyond the realm of science. And while they might never fully understand it, they knew they had witnessed something truly unforgettable.